Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, thank you, John P. A Man for All Seasons. That was I just looked it up. That was definitely the video I was talking about. I remember seeing it like 4 different times throughout my schooling growing up, and now that I know a little bit more of the backstory, I feel like I can actually pay attention and enjoy it in a way, honestly. So yeah, all right, we're doing the next episode. History Matters. 10-minute English and British history, number 18, late Tudors, Elizabeth, and the Spanish Armada. Let's go. If you're new, my name's Connor. Hello. I like to learn about history through YouTube recommendations. All the things. This is like my 5th video of the day. I'd recommend watching the previous episode. That's up to you. Let's get right into it. If you are not ready to learn, there's the door. You're in the wrong class. Get out. Or just sit and chill. Let's go.
1547, and King Henry VIII is dead. His son, the 9-year-old Edward, was crowned King Edward VI. He was too young to govern the kingdom on his own, and so a regency council was established to govern for him. This was led by his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. Somerset essentially ruled alone. He continued the anti-papal policies of Henry and even went a bit further, most notably by introducing the English language into church services. These changes were extremely divisive and upset the Catholics because they went too far, and upset the Protestants because they didn't go far enough. A new prayer book was created and its use made mandatory by the Act of Uniformity. These religious changes, coupled with a booming population and economic woes, led to riots. It should also be noted that England was still at war with France and Scotland at this point, and so Somerset levied heavy taxes to support these, which led to revolts in 1549. One such revolt was led by Robert Kett, a butcher who sought to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. Another riot was in Cornwall, which at this point didn't want the English language, which many there did not speak, forced into their churches. Somerset eventually crushed these revolts, but he was shortly afterwards removed from office by John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick quickly ended the wars with France and Scotland, and in 1551 he granted himself a new title, the Duke of Northumberland. King Edward, influenced by the reformist Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, reformed church services further by removing more Catholic elements, and a second prayer book was released to replace the first. In 1552 Edward caught measles, then a fever, and then tuberculosis, and it was pretty clear that he was going to die soon. Cranmer told the king that his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth weren't really Protestant enough and so should be barred from succeeding him. Edward selected Lady Jane Grey to succeed him, which she kind of did when Edward died in July 1553. Support for her claim died pretty quickly, and Edward's eldest half-sister Mary launched a coup only 9 days later. Jane was thrown in prison, and Northumberland, whose son was married to her, was convicted of treason and beheaded. Mary was crowned Mary I, and importantly was affirmed. Mary launched a coup only 9 days later. Jane was thrown in prison, and Northumberland, whose son was married to her, was convicted of treason and beheaded. Mary was crowned Mary I, and importantly was a firm Catholic, which is why she threw Thomas Cranmer into prison for heresy. Many were unhappy with the woman being in charge, and so she sought to strengthen her position by marrying Philippe Habsburg, the heir to the Spanish crown and all of these lands. This worried Parliament, who didn't want to be part of the Habsburg Empire, so it was decided that Philippe's power came exclusively from his marriage and that he held none in his own right. That said, Mary often asked for and followed his advice, meaning he held a great deal of power anyway, and he was certainly active in the running of the realm. Many of England's councils regularly briefed Philippe, some official documents were written in Spanish, and Philippe also sought the defence of Calais in England from French and Scottish threats. Of course, Philippe and Mary's primary concern was that of heresy and Protestant resistance. Mary wanted to return England to the Catholic world and appointed Reginald Pole as the Archbishop of Canterbury to help. Mary and Pole began a series of persecutions against Protestants, which saw just under 300 people being burned at the stake for heresy, the most notable being the former Archbishop himself, Thomas Cranmer. These acts of suppression would be the reason why Mary is nowadays known as Bloody Mary. Mary managed to get Parliament to repeal most of the religious laws enacted under her father and brother-in-law, and Archbishop Pole sought to bring in England back into the Catholic fold. Beyond this, the crown's finances were repaired, but a lot of this came from Philippe simply importing lots of Spanish silver from the New World. Mary and Philippe also oversaw the plantations of Ireland, which were where native Irish were removed from their lands and it was given to the English to settle and run. This was because Ireland had been slowly drifting away from English control, with many of its leaders only paying lip service. The idea was that by removing the Irish from their land and replacing them with loyal Englishmen, eventually Ireland would become as integrated as Wales was. Mary and Philippe were hoping for a son, and Mary had what is known as a phantom pregnancy, whereby she showed the symptoms of being with child, but without the child. This.
Why have I ever heard that bun in the oven?
pregnancy,
Status of bun in the oven.
whereby she showed the symptoms of being with child, but without the child. This upset Philippe, who left to become the King of Spain, and to make matters worse for Mary, famine, which killed about 5% of the English population. Philippe returned to England in 1557 bearing good news, by which I mean war with France. This war was expensive, unpopular, and ultimately a disaster, and ended with the loss of Calais in 1558. Mary would have another phantom pregnancy before dying in November of the same year, and she was succeeded by her half-sister, who was crowned Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was assisted by her close friend and advisor, Sir William Cecil, who was a loyal and gifted statesman who helped her settle into her role as queen. Elizabeth had inherited a religiously divided kingdom, and her first acts were to reverse the reunion with Rome, which led to the passing of the Second Act of Supremacy.
For whatever reason, I think to any sort of your average American, non-history sort of, if you just ask them to think of two, I'd say that Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, this one, are probably the two most well-known monarchs, if you don't count, the very recent ones.
In 1559. Elizabeth was actually a moderate Protestant and was willing to tolerate certain Catholic acts, but the zealotry of the Protestants around her made towing this line difficult. The religious settlement was sorted by 1563 with the creation of the 39 Articles which laid the doctrinal foundations for the Church of England. Matthew Parker was appointed as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and many of the exiled Protestants began to return to England. The settlement didn't just upset the Catholics but also another group, the Puritans. The Puritans believed that church reform hadn't gone far enough and tried to petition the Queen for change, but she refused. It was not just religion that plagued Elizabeth's early reign, but that of the succession and notably who she would marry. This issue became much more pressing in 1560 when Mary, the Queen of Scots, returned to Scotland from France. Mary was a relative of the powerful French family the Guises and also a descendant of Henry VII, and so had a claim to the throne and the money to back up that claim. She was also a Catholic and thus could persuade some of the population to help her remove a Protestant Elizabeth. If Elizabeth could get married and have a son though, it would be harder for her to press that claim. Elizabeth, as she tended to be, was slow to decide on a course of action and refused to be rushed. In her early reign she was infatuated with a man called Robert Dudley, and there was talk of a marriage except for one small issue. He was already married. His wife ended up a little bit dead, but in the end Elizabeth chose not to marry him. Ultimately, Elizabeth would never marry though, and often used her eligibility to suit diplomatic ends. In 1567, Mary, Queen of Scots, fell out with the Scottish nobility and was imprisoned and forced to abdicate, leaving her son James to take the throne. She escaped to England the next year, but Cecil advised Elizabeth to put her under house arrest. In 1569, there was a major Catholic rebellion in the north, many of whom sought to put Mary on the throne. Cecil crushed this revolt, but the problem of rebellious Catholics wouldn't go away since in 1570 the Pope declared that Elizabeth was an illegitimate queen, a heretic, and the Catholics shouldn't obey her. The later 16th century saw relations between Protestants and
30 Years' War incoming?
Catholics deteriorate massively and saw the outbreak of the French Wars of Religion and the Dutch Revolt. Elizabeth gave some help to the Dutch, which, along with the English raiding Spanish treasure ships, angered King Philippe II, who wanted this to stop. The result was war in 1585, which was mostly just raiding for the first couple of years. Concerns over along with the English raiding Spanish treasure ships angered King Philippe II, who wanted this to stop. The result was war in 1585, which was mostly just raiding for the first couple of years. Concerns over Catholics rebelling and aiding Mary take the throne led to Cecil having her beheaded, which angered Elizabeth. Elizabeth bought the neutrality of Scotland in this war with a lot of money and also hinting that James would succeed her as the King of England. In 1588, Philippe, who also controlled Portugal, sought to deal with England by launching a great armada which was supposed to rendezvous here with the large Spanish force and transport them to England. An English fleet led by Lord Howard met the Spanish here at the Battle of Gravelines. The English made greater use of cannons and prevented the Spanish from landing, which forced the Armada to return to Spain by going around the British Isles. The Armada was racked by storms and disease and limped back to Spain, a shadow of its former self. The next year, Elizabeth ordered Sir Francis Drake to launch a counterattack to free Portugal and destroy the Spanish fleet. To put it mildly, this counter-armada was a catastrophe and led to most of the English ships being sunk and many sailors dying from disease. Oops. Elizabeth's reign wasn't all religion and war though, and her rule saw great innovations in art and architecture. Art, such as portraiture, saw many changes, with Elizabeth being depicted many times with special emphasis being placed on her virginity, piety, and in her later years on portraying her still as young. Writers such as Edmund Spenser made greater artistic use of the English language, and his most famous work, The Fairy Queen, was so well liked by Elizabeth that she granted him a pension for life. Of course, the most famous writer of the age was not Spenser, but a certain William Shakespeare. Shakespeare outlived Elizabeth, but some of his most famous works were created in her reign, such as Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. He was not the only popular playwright of the age though, Christopher Marlowe was another. so the war with Spain continued onwards for the rest of the 16th century. England's role was mostly financing its continental allies and preventing the Spanish from landing in Ireland, in which Elizabeth was continuing the plantations, this time in the hope of increasing the loyalty of the south, which was where the enemy would most likely land. As she aged, Elizabeth started to take a back seat in the affairs of the realm. The war against Spain was run by her ministers, mostly Robert Cecil, the son of William, who had died in 1598. The church was run by John Whitgift, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who shared Elizabeth's dislike of Puritans and made sure to suppress them. England also saw harvest failures in 1596 and 7, which saw Parliament enact England's first poor relief schemes, which would stand until the 19th century. Another important long-standing creation of the Elizabethan age was the East India Company, which was founded in
I want to learn more about this.
1600 and given a monopoly on trade with the East Indies. Furthermore, the late 16th century also saw a major rebellion in Ireland led by Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. This 9-year rebellion was the most serious threat to the English re-establishing control over Ireland.
One of you guys sent me a link of a video about the East India Company, by the way.
Tyrone.
Check it out.
This 9-year rebellion was the most serious threat to the English re-establishing control over Ireland, and at first the Irish were very successful, their most notable victory being the Battle of the Yellow Ford here. The Irish were given assistance by the Spanish, and Elizabeth appointed Charles Blount, the Baron Mountjoy, to crush the revolt. In the end, the English were able to commit greater resources and defeated the Irish nobles, driving them out and opening the gates to further plantations. Tyrone's Rebellion, as it's known, importantly marks one of the last times the Irish could effectively resist English rule, and their loss broke the power of the Gaelic nobility, which had a pronounced effect on Irish culture. Of course, the great issue of Elizabeth's reign was the succession. She never married and made no attempt to nominate a successor, and so when she died in 1603, the throne went to someone who was related, Protestant and male. This man was King James VI of Scotland, who was proclaimed James I of England and Ireland. The accession of James I meant the end of the House of Tudor in England and the beginning there of the House of Stuart. Elizabeth's reign had many important legacies, but arguably the most important is that her reign spared England the immense turmoil and violence that shook the rest of Europe during the later 16th century. She is best remembered for her resilience during the war with Spain, but remember that the Armada was destroyed not during a battle, but during a storm. It was also worth noting
Mongols invading Japan, kind of just made me think of that.
But remember that the Armada was destroyed not during a battle, but during a storm. It was also worth noting that Elizabeth's primary duty was to secure the succession, which she failed to do, and it was fortunate that no one challenged James's claim and plunged England into a civil war. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
No one did?
Worth noting that Elizabeth's primary duty was to secure the succession, which she failed to do, and it was fortunate that no one challenged James's claim and plunged England into a civil war.
Sarcasm. So I'm trying to kind of wonder whether she was using her not having an heir, that quality of hers, as a tool to kind of keep pushing throughout her life. Like, oh, maybe I'll marry over here, over here. Maybe she would think that having a male husband would mean she would lose a lot of power and he might get some, or other reasons, maybe infertility or something. I'm not exactly sure, but awesome. I know these don't go that in depth, but they at least give me a nice summary of what happened. So later I can go, I'm in this for the long haul. I can go deeper and deeper in layers, redundancy, understanding it better and better. Awesome. I'm going to finish the next 2 episodes tomorrow, I believe. If not, the day after that. Likely tomorrow, though. Hope y'all are doing well. I mean that. See y'all next time.